I've never really been paranoid about home security. I live in a pretty normal neighborhood, and I always figured as long as I locked my doors at night, I was safe. But after what happened last year, I'll never feel truly secure in my own home again. It started with small things I barely noticed at first. One night I came home from work and found the closet door in my bedroom slightly open. I always keep it shut, so I figured maybe I had bumped into it earlier or just forgotten. I shrugged it off. A couple of days later, I noticed something else. A faint smell in my bedroom. It wasn't bad, just different. Like stale sweat, mixed with something else I couldn't place. Again, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the laundry basket needed emptying. But then, one night, something happened that made me start to question everything. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a soft creak. It was so quiet that at first I thought I imagined it. But then I heard it again. It was coming from the closet. I turned my head slowly, and my stomach dropped. The door, which I had closed earlier, was open just an inch wider than before. My blood turned to ice. I sat up in bed, staring at the door, barely breathing. It was like every nerve in my body was screaming at me that something was wrong. But still, I tried to be rational. Maybe there was a draft. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. I got up, walked over, and pulled it shut, making sure it latched this time. Then I went back to bed, my heart still pounding. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I got up, went to work, and tried to forget about it. But when I got home that evening and went into my bedroom, the closet door was wide open. At this point, my stomach was in knots. I knew for a fact I had closed it before leaving. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept under my bed and walked toward the closet, my hands shaking. With one deep breath, I swung the door open. Nothing. Just my clothes, my shoes, the usual junk. No one there. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly in the morning. Maybe it was just one of those things. I forced myself to calm down. But that night, something happened that shattered any illusion of safety I had left. I woke up in the middle of the night, my mouth dry, needing a glass of water. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and glanced toward the closet. And I swear to God, I saw movement inside. Just a slight shift, like someone adjusting their weight. Every hair on my body stood up. My breathing went shallow. I knew I had closed that door. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers and turned on the flashlight. That's when I saw it. A hand. Pale, motionless, just barely visible between my hanging shirts. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted out of my room, down the hallway, and straight out of my house. I didn't stop until I was standing in my driveway, barefoot and shaking, my heart threatening to explode out of my chest. I called 911 and barely managed to get the words out. The cops arrived within minutes, but when they searched the house, whoever had been in my closet was gone. But they did find something. The closet had a crawl space in the back, one I had never noticed before. It led to a narrow passage between the walls, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. Inside that crawl space, they found a makeshift sleeping area, an old blanket, food wrappers, empty water bottles. Someone had been living inside my house. I don't know how long he had been there, or how many nights he had watched me sleep. But the thought of it still makes me feel sick. I moved out the next week. I used to think that living with roommates made you safer, more people in the house, less chance of anything bad happening, right? But after what happened to me and my 2 roommates last year, I'm not so sure anymore. At the time, I was living in a 3-bedroom rental house with my friends Jake and Ryan. We were all in our mid-20s, working different jobs and had totally different schedules. Sometimes we'd all be home at the same time, but more often than not, at least one of us was out late for work or with friends. Our house was in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it had a long, dark hallway that always creeped me out a little. At night, if you were in the living room, you could barely see down it unless all the lights were on. It was just a black void leading to our bedrooms. The weird stuff started happening about a week before things escalated. At first, it was little things. Doors that we knew we had closed being open in the morning. The back door being unlocked when we were certain we locked it before bed. We joked about it, blaming each other. But deep down, it was starting to freak me out. Then came the noises. Ryan, who worked the latest shifts, started mentioning that he would hear creaking in the hallway when he got home around 2 a.m. He said it sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps. But when he'd check, there'd be nothing there. Jake and I just laughed it off. "Dude, you're just tired. Houses settle," I told him. But then, a few nights later, I heard them too. It was past midnight, and I was in my room watching YouTube when I heard slow, heavy footsteps moving down the hallway. At first, I thought it was Ryan getting home from work. But then I realized something. Ryan wasn't working that night. We were all home. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The footsteps weren't coming from any of our rooms. They were coming from the hallway itself. I texted our group chat, "Are either of you up right now?" Jake, "No, why?" Me, "I swear to God, someone's in the hallway." Not even 5 seconds later, I heard Jake's door swing open. He stepped out, looking half asleep, but I could see in his face that he wasn't just humoring me. He had heard it too. Ryan's door creaked open next. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. We stood there, frozen, listening. The house was dead silent. Then out of nowhere, we heard it. A long, slow exhale. Right in front of us. I can't even describe the terror that shot through me. The 3 of us bolted back into Jake's room and locked the door, whispering frantically about what to do. Jake grabbed a baseball bat he kept under his bed, and Ryan was already dialing 911. As we waited for the cops, we heard something that made my stomach drop, the unmistakable sound of our front door opening. Someone had been in the house. With us. We heard heavy footsteps retreating down the porch steps, and then silence. When the cops arrived, they found clear signs of forced entry on the back door. But the most terrifying part? They found a blanket and food wrappers tucked behind the water heater in our laundry room. Whoever had been in our house had been staying there. The cops guessed he had been sneaking in at night, hiding while we were home, and helping himself to whatever he could steal. That realization still makes my skin crawl, knowing we had coexisted with a stranger in our own house for who knows how long. We moved out a month later, and to this day, I can't sleep unless I check every door and every closet. I always thought home invasions happened suddenly, like in the movies where someone breaks down the door, grabs what they want, and leaves. I never imagined that one could happen slowly, over weeks, with the intruder watching and waiting. But that's exactly what happened to me. At the time, I lived in a small house with my fiancée, Sarah. It was a cozy little place in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy, but we loved it. The house had a big sliding glass door in the living room that led to our backyard, and most nights, we'd leave the blinds open to let in the moonlight. The first weird thing happened on a Thursday night. Sarah and I were watching TV when she suddenly got this weird expression and said, "Did you hear that?" I hadn't, but she swore she heard something outside, like footsteps in the yard. I muted the TV and we both sat there listening. The night was dead quiet. After a few minutes, we convinced ourselves it was just a raccoon or something, and went back to watching our show. The next morning, I went outside to take out the trash and noticed something strange. The side gate was open. We always kept it closed, and there was no reason for it to be open. I mentioned it to Sarah, but we figured maybe one of the neighbors had wandered in by accident or the wind had blown it open. A few nights later, things got worse. It was around 1 a.m., and I had just gotten up to get some water. As I walked past the sliding glass door, I felt it. That weird sensation of being watched. I turned my head, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move in the yard. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. I stood there for a moment, convincing myself I was just imagining things, then grabbed my water and went back to bed. The next morning, I checked outside. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Clear, deep footprints in the dirt outside the sliding door. They weren't mine, and they weren't Sarah's. Someone had been standing there in the middle of the night, watching. I felt sick. I immediately installed motion-activated floodlights in the backyard and set up a camera. I figured if someone was creeping around, I'd catch them. And I did. The following night, around 1:30 a.m., I was woken up by the security app notification on my phone. I opened the live camera feed, and my blood ran cold. There, standing right outside our glass door, was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by the hood of a jacket. He was just standing there, staring into the house. He wasn't trying to break in. He wasn't even moving. He was just watching. The moment the floodlights kicked on, he bolted. He ran across the yard and hopped the fence like he'd done it before. I woke Sarah up and showed her the footage. She was terrified. We called the police, but by the time they got there, the guy was long gone. They took a report and told us to keep our doors and windows locked. But then, the officer said something that made my stomach drop. You'd be surprised how often people like this watch a house for weeks before making a move. The next day, we packed a bag and stayed at Sarah's parents' place for a week, while we installed a security system and replaced all the locks. The guy never came back. Or at least, not that we know of. But every time I walk past that sliding door at night, I wonder, how many times had he stood there before we noticed? I was living alone at the time in a small rental house just outside of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was quiet, and I liked having my own space. The house had one of those old-school crawl spaces underneath, the kind that landlords never check unless there's a plumbing issue. For the first few months, everything was normal. But then, small things started happening, things I brushed off at the time. One morning, I woke up to find my back door unlocked. I always made sure to lock my doors before bed, so I chalked it up to me being absent-minded and went about my day. Then, a few nights later, I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I swore I heard something shuffling outside. Not an animal, not the wind, something slow and deliberate. I turned off the kitchen light to see outside better, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. A few days after that, I came home from work and noticed that a couple of things in my house weren't where I left them. A coffee mug was on the counter instead of in the sink. My bedroom door was slightly ajar when I knew I had closed it that morning, and my couch throw blanket was bunched up in a weird way. almost like someone had been sitting there. I told myself I was just being forgetful, that maybe I had moved things around without realizing it. But deep down, I started to feel uneasy in my own home. Then came the worst part, the noises. It started late at night when the house was completely silent. I'd be lying in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I'd hear a faint thump from somewhere beneath the floor. At first, I told myself it had to be the house settling. But then, the sounds got weirder. Scraping noises, like someone was shifting things around. At one point, I swore I heard whispering, muffled through the vents. By this point, I was really freaked out. I started double-checking my locks every night and keeping a baseball bat next to my bed. Then, one night, it all escalated. I was watching TV when I heard a noise that sent ice through my veins. A cough. A human cough. It was coming from the vent near my couch. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. My mind raced. Was someone inside my house? I grabbed my phone, stood up slowly, and listened. Then, another noise. This time from outside. It was faint, but I could hear shuffling near the back of the house. I forced myself to move. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and bolted to check the back door. Still locked. But that only made it worse. If someone was inside, they had to have already been in here. My hands were shaking as I called 911. I whispered to the dispatcher what I was hearing, and she told me to stay on the line and not go near the vents or doors. I stood in my hallway, my back pressed against the wall, listening to every little creak of the house, every shift of air. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. From the vent, I heard the sound of fabric shifting, like someone moving in a sleeping bag. The dispatcher stayed on the phone with me as I waited for the cops. Every second felt like an hour. I kept thinking about all the times I had been alone in that house, completely unaware that someone else might have been inside the whole time. When the cops finally arrived, they searched the house. Nothing. Then they checked the crawl space. And that's where they found it. There was a sleeping bag shoved into the corner, along with empty water bottles, food wrappers, and even a small flashlight. There was also a hole in the floorboards, just big enough for someone to peek through the vent into my living room. The worst part? They found a crude drawing on the underside of one of the floorboards. It was a rough, childlike sketch of my living room, with a stick figure sitting on the couch. The police told me that whoever had been living under my house had probably been there for weeks, if not longer. They suspected he had been sneaking inside when I wasn't home, moving things just slightly, watching me through the vents at night. I packed a bag that night and stayed with a friend until I could move out. They never found the guy. To this day, I have no idea who he was, how he got in, or what his ultimate plan was. But knowing that he had been watching me for so long, living just beneath my feet, still makes my skin crawl. I never really thought about home security before this happened. I always figured locking my doors at night was enough. After all, I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever happened. But that all changed one night when I realized someone had been watching me. At the time, I lived alone in a small, single-story house on a cul-de-sac. I worked from home most days, so I didn't go out much, and my backyard was my favorite place to unwind. I had a nice little patio set up, string lights, a comfy lounge chair, and a small fire pit where I'd sit and read at night. One evening, I was outside like usual, enjoying the cool breeze while scrolling on my phone. It was late, maybe around midnight, and the neighborhood was dead quiet. I liked the peace of it. Then, out of nowhere, I got this weird feeling, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, but the unease just grew. I glanced up from my phone and looked toward the wooden fence that separated my yard from the alley behind it. That's when I saw it. A shadow. A tall figure standing just beyond the fence, motionless. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor taking a late-night walk, but something about it felt wrong. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't passing through the alley like a normal person. It was just standing there, facing my backyard. My stomach dropped. I quickly turned off my phone screen so I wouldn't be as visible and sat there, frozen, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Then the figure moved. Slowly, it stepped forward, and I heard the faint sound of something creaking, the wooden slats of my fence shifting under pressure. Someone was trying to climb over. I shot up from my chair and back toward my back door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the handle. Just as I got inside and locked the door, I heard it. A thud against the fence, like someone had dropped down into my yard. My heart was pounding. I turned off all the lights, grabbed my phone, and ducked behind my kitchen counter. Through the sliding glass door, I could see a faint silhouette standing in my yard. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I called 911, whispering to the operator that someone had broken into my backyard. She told me to stay hidden and keep the line open while officers were dispatched. As I peeked out again, the figure finally moved, but not in the way I expected. Instead of coming toward the house, they walked toward the side gate and unlocked it from the inside. My breath caught in my throat. That meant only one thing. They had been in my backyard before. The realization made me feel sick. This wasn't some random break-in. This person had already been inside my yard at some point, unlocked the gate, and left it that way so they could come back. I could barely breathe as I heard the gate swing open, the sound of footsteps disappearing into the alley. By the time the police arrived, the person was long gone. They searched the yard and found clear footprints in the dirt near the fence, along with something else. A set of deep scratches on the outside of my back door, right near the lock. The officer asked me if I had heard anything strange before tonight. I told him no. But after thinking about it, I had noticed little things I brushed off at the time. A couple of times I found my patio chair moved slightly. One morning my hose had been pulled out of its holder and left stretched across the yard. Small, insignificant things I had written off as my own forgetfulness. But now, I knew the truth. Someone had been sneaking into my yard, watching me, waiting for the right moment. I had a security system installed the next day, along with motion sensor lights and new locks on every door. I never sat outside at night again. I used to believe that if you locked your doors at night, you were safe. That as long as you lived in a quiet neighborhood and didn't do anything to attract trouble, nothing bad would happen to you. I don't believe that anymore. This happened last winter when I was staying at my sister's house while she was out of town. She lives in a nice, quiet suburb, the kind of place where people leave their bikes in the yard and don't worry too much about break-ins. She had asked me to house sit for the week while she was away, and since I worked remotely, it was no big deal. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I made myself at home, worked during the day, watched Netflix at night, and enjoyed having a whole house to myself. But by the third night, weird things started happening. The first thing I noticed was the footprints in the snow. It had snowed lightly that morning, and by the time I went outside to grab the mail, there were fresh footprints leading from the sidewalk to the back of the house. The weird part? There were no footprints leading away. It was like someone had walked up to the back door and never left. I checked the door, but it was still locked. I figured maybe it was just a delivery guy or a meter reader or something, and I tried to shake it off. That night I was in the living room, bundled up on the couch when I heard it. The front doorknob rattling. I froze. It wasn't a knock, and it wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. Someone was trying to turn the handle. I muted the TV and sat there, my pulse thudding in my ears. The rattling stopped after a few seconds, but then I heard another sound, a faint scraping at the back door. It hit me all at once. Whoever had left those footprints had come back. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, trying to stay quiet. I could hear it clearer now. Someone was picking the lock. I called 911 and whispered to the operator what was happening. She told me to stay inside, lock myself in a room, and wait for the police. Then something happened that made my stomach drop. The back door unlocked. I didn't think. I ran straight to my sister's bedroom, locked the door, and hid in the closet. My whole body was shaking as I pressed the phone against my ear, whispering to the dispatcher. I could hear the back door creak open. Footsteps inside the house. Slow, steady footsteps moving through the kitchen. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew they had time. I was holding my breath, terrified that if I made a sound, they'd know exactly where I was. Then they stopped, right outside the bedroom door. I could see the shadow of their feet under the gap. My entire body was frozen in fear. The handle jiggled. That's when I heard the most chilling part of all. A whisper through the door. "Why are you in my house?" It wasn't angry. It wasn't confused. It was calm, like they were just making conversation. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the cops to get here faster. The person stayed there, standing outside the door for what felt like forever. Then, sirens. The person turned and ran. I heard the back door slam, then nothing. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was gone. They searched the house and found something that still haunts me. The attic hatch was open. There was a makeshift bed up there. Piles of old blankets, empty food wrappers, even some of my sister's belongings that had gone missing. Whoever had been in the house had probably been living there for days. The cops said he must have slipped in at some point before I arrived, maybe while my sister was out running errands, and had been hiding out ever since. But the worst part? When they checked the security footage from my sister's doorbell camera, they saw him, standing on the porch the night before, just staring at the door for over an hour,